Picture this. You're standing in the dusty marketplace of a small English village in 1820, watching what appears to be a normal day of commerce. Farmers are selling their livestock, merchants are hawking their wares, and then something catches your eye that makes your blood run cold. A man is leading a woman by a rope around her neck toward the auction block. She's not a criminal being led to punishment. She's his wife, and he's about to sell her to the highest bidder like a piece of property. The auctioneer's voice booms across the crowd as he describes her qualities. Strong back for farm work, good with children, excellent cook, only 25 years old. Men in the crowd examine her teeth, test her grip, and ask pointed questions about her ability to bear children. The woman stands silent, her eyes fixed on the ground, as strangers debate her worth in shillings and pence. This isn't fiction. This isn't some twisted fantasy from a horror novel. This was reality for thousands of women in Victorian Britain, trapped in a legal and social system that treated them as chattel to be bought, sold, and traded at their husband's whim. The practice was so common that newspapers, regularly same casual tone they use, reported on wife sales with Thed for livestock auctions. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these dark chapters together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. What you're about to discover will shatter any romanticized notions you might have about Victorian marriage. Behind the elegant ball gowns and proper courtship rituals lay a brutal reality where women had fewer legal rights than the livestock their husbands owned. A married woman in Victorian England was legally classified as femme covert, a legal term meaning she was literally covered by her husband's identity. She couldn't own property, couldn't sign contracts, couldn't even claim ownership of her own children. The law stated explicitly that husband and wife are one person in law, and that person is the husband. When a woman married, everything she owned, her money, her inheritance, her personal possessions, even the clothes on her back, automatically became her husband's property. She ceased to exist as a legal entity, becoming instead a possession herself. But here's where the story gets truly horrifying. If a husband grew tired of his wife, or if he needed quick cash, or if he simply wanted to be rid of her, he could sell her. The practice had no legal standing, but it was widely accepted by communities across Britain. Magistrates turned a blind eye, neighbors gathered to watch, and newspapers treated it as entertainment. The ritual of wife-selling followed a grotesque parody of legitimate commerce. The husband would place a halter, a rope typically used for leading cattle, around his wife's neck and lead her to the local marketplace. Sometimes he would advertise the sale in advance, posting notices like those used for livestock auctions. The woman would be displayed on the same platforms where farmers sold their pigs and sheep, examined by potential buyers who treated her like any other piece of merchandise. Thomas Hardy wasn't exaggerating when he depicted this practice in The Mayor of Casterbridge. His fictional account was based on countless real cases that horrified and fascinated Victorian society. Hardy had read newspaper reports of actual wife sales, and his novel's opening scene, where Michael Henchard sells his wife Susan while drunk at a country fair, was drawn directly from documented historical events. Consider the case of Mary Andrews, sold by her husband in Birmingham's Bullring Market in 1796 for the price of 1 guinea. The Birmingham Gazette reported that she appeared to be a healthy young woman of about 26 years of age, and that the sale was conducted with the same formalities as those observed in the sale of cattle. The buyer, a local blacksmith named William Thompson, examined Mary's teeth, tested her grip, and negotiated with her husband over her asking price before completing the transaction. Or take the disturbing account of Elizabeth Whitehouse, whose husband Samuel sold her at Smithfield Market in London in 1815. The Morning Chronicle described how Samuel led Elizabeth through the streets with a new rope halter about her neck, while advertising her virtues to potential buyers. The newspaper noted with casual indifference that the woman seemed perfectly resigned to her fate, and that she appeared to be about 30 years of age, rather ordinary in appearance, but strong and healthy. What makes these accounts even more chilling is the matter-of-fact tone with which they were reported. Ached professionalism they used for horse newspapers described wife sales with the same debt auctions or sheep trading. The Morning Herald's report of a wife sale in Canterbury Market in 1823 reads like a livestock report. The woman appeared to be about 28 years of age, of the middle size, and not ill-looking. She was sold for $1 to a man who appeared to know her well. The buyers weren't always strangers. In many cases, the transaction was a crude form of divorce in a society where legal divorce was nearly impossible for the working class. A woman might arrange with her lover to purchase her from her husband, effectively transferring her from one man to another with the husband's consent. This gave all parties a way to dissolve an unwanted marriage without the expense and social scandal of formal legal proceedings. But the practice went far beyond these quasi-consensual arrangements. Many wives were sold against their will to complete strangers, often to men who had specific purposes in mind. Farmers bought wives to work their land. Merchants purchased them to manage their shops. Some men bought wives simply because they needed someone to care for their children from previous relationships. The geographical scope of wife selling was staggering. Records exist of sales in markets from Cornwall to Scotland, in industrial cities and rural villages, among the urban poor and country farmers. The practice peaked in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, but continued well into the Victorian era. The last recorded wife sale in England didn't take place until 1913, just a few years before women finally gained the right to vote. What drove men to sell their wives? Economic desperation was often a factor. In an era when unemployment could mean starvation, a husband might sell his wife to raise money for rent or food. The historian Samuel Payet Menifee, who conducted the most comprehensive study of wife selling, found that many sales occurred during periods of economic hardship when families faced eviction or destitution. But money wasn't the only motivation. Some men sold their wives out of spite, revenge, or simple cruelty. Others did it to escape the legal obligations of marriage in a society where divorce was prohibitively expensive and socially ruinous. A man who sold his wife could claim he was no longer responsible for her debts or her behavior, effectively freeing himself from the legal bonds of matrimony without formal divorce proceedings. The prices paid for wives varied enormously, reflecting both the economic circumstances of the participants and the perceived value of the woman being sold. Some wives sold for as little as a few pence, the price of a loaf of bread. Others commanded prices equivalent to several months' wages for a laborer. The most expensive recorded sale was that of a farmer's wife in Pontefract, who sold for £5, a substantial sum that could have purchased a good horse or funded a family for months. The haggling process was often brutal and dehumanizing. Potential buyers would examine the woman's teeth to check her health, feel her muscles to assess her strength for physical labor, and question her about her domestic skills. They might ask about her ability to cook, sew, manage a household, or bear children. Some buyers conducted intimate examinations to verify that the woman was free from disease or physical defects that might affect her value. The psychological impact on the women being sold was devastating beyond measure. Imagine standing on that auction block, feeling the rough rope around your neck while strangers evaluated your worth like livestock. Contemporary accounts describe women who remained stoically silent throughout their sales, but this silence wasn't acceptance, it was survival. Speaking out, protesting, or showing emotion would only make the situation worse, potentially angering both the husband and potential buyers. Sarah Fletcher's story illustrates this horrific reality. Sold by her husband in Chester Market in 1832, Sarah later wrote in her diary about the experience. She described feeling as though my very soul had been stripped bare and offered for inspection by any man with coins in his pocket. She wrote of the humiliation of having strange men examine her hands for calluses, check her posture for signs of weakness, and ask intimate questions about her monthly cycles and childbearing history. What's particularly chilling is how the community participated in these sales. Neighbors who had known these women for years would gather to watch the proceedings like entertainment. Children were brought along to witness what adults considered a normal part of commerce. Local magistrates, who had the power to stop these illegal transactions, instead often attended as spectators or even as potential buyers themselves. The legal system's complicity in wife-selling reveals the depths of institutional misogyny in Victorian Britain. While the practice had no basis in law, authorities rarely intervened. Magistrates reasoned that since the women weren't being physically harmed and the sales were conducted openly, they fell into a grey area of custom and tradition. This willful blindness allowed the practice to flourish for over a century. Consider the case of Magistrate Sir William Blackstone, who wrote extensively about English law, but dismissed wife-selling as a vulgar error rather than condemning it as illegal. His influential legal commentaries helped normalize the practice by treating it as a curious custom rather than a serious crime against women's humanity. Other legal authorities argued that since marriage made a woman her husband's property anyway, he had the right to dispose of that property as he saw fit. The economic realities behind wife-selling were often more complex than simple greed or desperation. In many cases, families were caught in impossible financial situations created by the rigid class structure of Victorian society. A labourer who injured himself and couldn't work faced the choice between watching his family starve or finding some way to reduce the number of mouths to feed. Selling his wife to a man who could support her might seem like the lesser evil in such desperate circumstances. But this economic justification masks the true horror of the practice. Women had no voice in these life-altering decisions. They couldn't divorce abusive husbands, couldn't own property to support themselves, couldn't even legally prevent their own sale. They were trapped in a system designed to ensure their complete dependence on male relatives or spouses. The buyers' motivations were equally disturbing. Many men purchased wives specifically because they wanted someone completely powerless and dependent. A woman bought at market had no family connections to protect her, no legal recourse if mistreated, and no option to leave her new husband since he had paid money for her. This created a dynamic of absolute power that some men found irresistible. James Morrison, a wealthy merchant who bought 3 different wives at various markets between 1798 and 1805, kept detailed records of his purchases. His journals, discovered in his estate papers, reveal a calculating predator who specifically sought women whose desperate circumstances made them completely vulnerable. He wrote of preferring women who had been abandoned by their families or who came from extreme poverty, reasoning that they would be grateful for any improvement in their circumstances and unlikely to cause trouble. The process of wife-selling also involved elaborate rituals designed to give the transaction an air of legitimacy. Sellers often required the ceremony to take place in traditional market locations, believing this gave their actions legal weight. They insisted on witnesses, proper documentation of the sale price, and sometimes even primitive contracts outlining the terms of the transaction. These formalities created a veneer of respectability around what was essentially human trafficking. The role of alcohol in many wife sales cannot be overlooked. Countless transactions began in taverns, where desperate husbands drowned their sorrows while contemplating their options. Alcohol lowered inhibitions and made the unthinkable seem reasonable. Many wives were sold by men who were too drunk to fully comprehend what they were doing, only to wake the next morning to discover they had signed away another human being's freedom for the price of a few more drinks. The aftermath of wife sales reveals the long-term trauma inflicted on all parties involved. Women who had been sold often suffered from what we would now recognize as severe depression and anxiety. They lived in constant fear that their new husband might decide to sell them again if they displeased him. Children from these arrangements grew up understanding that their mothers could be bought and sold like property, creating psychological damage that echoed through generations. Mary Catherine Jenkins, sold in 1845 at the age of 19, spent the rest of her life documenting the psychological effects of her experience. Her writings, preserved in local archives, describe nightmares where she relived the auction, periods of deep depression where she couldn't leave her bed, and an overwhelming sense that she was worthless as a human being. She wrote, "They looked at me as though I were no more valuable than a sack of grain, and in time, I came to see myself the same way." The social acceptance of wife selling reflected broader attitudes about women's place in Victorian society. If women were naturally inferior to men, if they required male guidance and protection, if they were fundamentally incapable of independent thought and action, then treating them as property seemed logical rather than monstrous. The practice was both symptom and cause of women's oppression, reinforcing beliefs about female inferiority while providing a practical mechanism for male control. The Church's role in perpetuating wife-selling reveals another layer of institutional complicity that makes this practice even more disturbing. Rather than condemning the sales as violations of Christian marriage vows, many clergy members actively participated in legitimizing the transactions. Priests would perform mock ceremonies to marry sold wives to their new owners, complete with vows and blessings that parodied sacred matrimony. Reverend Thomas Whitaker of St. Mary's Church in Yorkshire kept detailed records of these ceremonies between 1801 and 1823. His parish logs describe blessing the unions of at least 17 women who had been purchased at local markets. In one entry from 1815, he wrote matter-of-factly about marrying Elizabeth Cooper, lately purchased from her former husband William Cooper by Thomas Fletcher for the sum of £2 10 in the presence of witnesses who can attest to the proper transfer of ownership. The psychological manipulation inherent in these religious ceremonies added another dimension of cruelty to an already horrific practice. Women who had been traumatized by their sale were then forced to participate in a sacred ritual that blessed their commodification. They had to speak vows of obedience and love to men who had literally purchased them, creating a twisted spiritual dimension to their captivity. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of wife selling was how it evolved into a sophisticated marketplace with its own economics and social structures. Regular buyers emerged, men who made a business of purchasing and multiple markets, acquiring women in areas where prices were low and transporting them to regions reselling wives based on market demand. These human traffickers would attend Hartwell, known as the wife where they could command higher prices. William Trader, in the industrial towns networks from 1820 to 1841 of northern England, operated one of these operations that treated women as commodity investments. Court documents from his eventual trial reveal a systematic rural areas for between 5 and 10 shillings, then transport them to industrial. Hartwell would purchase wives from desperate husbands in cities where labor shortages drove up their value. He could resell the same women for £2 to £5, making substantial profits on human misery. Hartwell kept meticulous business records that survive in legal archives, providing a horrifying window into the economics of human trafficking. His ledgers list women by their physical attributes and skills. Strong blonde, good teeth, experienced with sheep, purchased 7 shillings, sold £3, 2 shillings. Another entry reads, dark-haired girl, about 20, excellent seamstress, but rather thin, purchased 4 shillings, sold £1 15 shillings after feeding for 3 weeks. The feeding reference reveals another disturbing aspect of the trade. Hartwell and others like him would improve their human merchandise before resale, fattening up thin women, teaching basic domestic skills to those who lacked them, and even providing crude medical care to address obvious health problems. This wasn't compassion, it was investment management, designed to maximize the return on human property. The transportation of sold wives became its own cottage industry. Specialized wagons, similar to those used for transporting livestock, carried women between markets. These vehicles were designed with locks and restraints to prevent escape, and drivers were paid bonuses for delivering their human cargo undamaged. The routes became known as wife roads, and inns along these paths offered special accommodations for dealers transporting their purchases. Martha Thornfield's account, written years after her rescue, describes the journey from market to market in one of these wagons. She wrote of being chained alongside other women, fed scraps like animals, and forced to sleep in straw that hadn't been changed for weeks. "We were less than cattle to them," she recalled, "for at least cattle are fed properly to maintain their value. We were allowed to waste away as long as we lived long enough to reach the next market." The seasonal nature of wife selling aligned with agricultural and economic cycles in ways that revealed the cold calculation behind the practice. Spring sales coincided with planting season, when farmers needed additional labor. Summer markets catered to harvest demands. Winter sales often involved desperate families selling wives to reduce expenses during the lean months. Christmas markets became particularly brutal, as men used holiday gatherings as opportunities to dispose of unwanted spouses, while extended families were present to witness the transactions. The development of specialized markets for different types of wives shows how thoroughly commercialized the practice had become. London's Smithfield Market became known for younger women suitable for bearing children. Birmingham's Bull Ring specialized in skilled domestic workers. Liverpool's docks catered to men seeking wives for colonial ventures, women who could endure harsh conditions in foreign territories. Each market developed its own reputation and pricing structure based on local demand. The colonial connection adds another layer of horror to wife selling. British men emigrating to Australia, India, or the Americas often purchased wives specifically for the journey, knowing they would need domestic help in their new homes. These women faced the additional trauma of being transported thousands of miles from everything familiar, with no possibility of return or rescue. Colonial records describe ships carrying purchased wives alongside other cargo, with women listed in manifests between livestock and household goods. The insurance industry even developed policies to protect buyers' investments. Lloyd's of London offered coverage against the death or escape of purchased wives during transport or within the first year of ownership. The policies treated women exactly like any other valuable property, with premiums based on age, health, and assessed flight risk. Claims records reveal the casual brutality with which insurance adjusters evaluated human suffering, noting deaths from natural causes, excessive discipline, or failure to adapt to new circumstances. The legal loopholes that allowed wife selling to flourish were deliberately maintained by a system that benefited from women's powerlessness. When reformers attempted to challenge the practice in court, they faced a legal establishment that had built careers on maintaining existing power structures. Judges who owned slaves in the colonies saw no contradiction in allowing the domestic sale of wives. Magistrates who controlled their own wives' property had little incentive to challenge a system that reinforced male dominance. The few legal challenges that did succeed often focused on technicalities rather than the fundamental injustice of treating women as property. In 1834, the case of Regina versus Jackson established that a husband couldn't sell his wife without her consent, but the ruling was so narrowly applied that it had little practical effect. Judges interpreted consent to include silence during the sale, resignation to circumstances, or even the absence of physical resistance. The legal system found ways to legitimize almost any transaction that men wanted to conduct. The psychological techniques used to break women's resistance before and during sales reveal a sophisticated understanding of how to destroy human agency. Sellers would isolate their wives from family and friends weeks before the transaction, creating dependency and despair. They would spread rumors about the woman's character or abilities, undermining her self-worth and reducing her market value as a form of control. They would alternate between kindness and cruelty, creating psychological confusion that made resistance seem futile. Dr. Henry Maudsley, a Victorian physician who studied the mental health effects of wife-selling, documented the systematic psychological destruction these women endured. His clinical notes describe patients who had developed what he termed property psychosis, a condition where women began to see themselves entirely through the lens of their commercial value. They would compulsively describe their own skills and attributes in market terms, speaking of themselves as livestock might be described in auction catalogues. The children born from these transactions faced their own unique forms of trauma. They grew up understanding that their mothers had been purchased like any other household item, creating profound questions about identity and self-worth. Many developed severe behavioral problems, struggling with concepts of love and family when their primary example was a commercial transaction. Others became perpetrators themselves, seeing the buying and selling of women as normal adult behavior. The communities that allowed wife-selling to flourish weren't passive observers, but active participants in a system of organized oppression. Neighbors who attended sales weren't merely curious spectators. They were enforcing social norms that kept women powerless. Their presence sent a clear message that female autonomy was so unimportant that its complete elimination could serve as public entertainment. The practice of wife-selling finally ended not through moral awakening, but through economic necessity. As industrialization transformed British society and women began entering the workforce, their value as independent economic actors made their treatment as property increasingly impractical. The Married Women's Property Acts of the 1870s and 1880s gradually restored legal personhood to married women, making wife sales legally impossible rather than morally unacceptable. But the psychological and social damage lasted generations. The normalization of treating women as commodities created patterns of thinking that persisted long after the markets closed. The casual brutality with which Victorian society accepted the buying and selling of human beings reveals uncomfortable truths about how quickly civilized people can rationalize the unthinkable when it serves their interests. These stories matter because they remind us that progress isn't inevitable and rights aren't permanent. The women who stood silent on those auction blocks, who endured examination like livestock, who lived as purchased property, they were real people whose suffering was enabled by a society that convinced itself such treatment was natural and necessary. Their voices, silenced by rope and circumstance, still echo across the centuries with a simple but profound message. Remember us, learn from our suffering, and never forget how quickly humanity can be reduced to a price tag when people choose convenience over compassion.